What is up, everyone? I'm Carmine and you're watching another episode of Super Carmio. In today's episode we'll be focusing on the MK4 GTI sitting right behind me. On prior episodes I did mention that I wanted to clean up the engine bay even further, possibly make room for a bigger turbo, because why not? So today we'll be moving the battery from the engine bay all the way to the trunk. And we're doing this for two reasons. One, to clear up some more room, but two, there is a common issue on the MK4s where the plastic fuse panel that sits on top of the battery actually overheats and melts and causes all types of fun issues. So we're also going to rebuild that circuit for enhanced reliability. So with all that out of the way, let's get started. Alright guys, so this is where we're going to be spending a lot of our time today. As you can see, we have our stock battery right here, and then there's this fuse panel right on top of it. So we want to basically not only replace all of this, but relocate the battery to the trunk. And in order to do that, we'll be using this Moroso battery box. And then we have all of the components to recreate this fuse box at the top of the battery. And then of course we have our 1/0 gauge wire. So we're going to get started by removing all the components on top of the battery as well as the battery itself. Up next, we'll remove the battery tray, get that out of the way, and then we'll probably move to the back and relocate the battery. Alright, with the battery and tray removed, we could have a pretty good look at what was going on over here in terms of the wiring. So you'll see that we have a cable that went directly from the battery to our starter right here. And then we had connection to this fuse panel over here. And we have, I think, 3 30 amp lower power circuits here. We have bigger circuits over here, including the fan control, and then this wire over here, which is on a 110 amp circuit that is going to our alternator. We'll save the rewiring of the circuit for later, but right now we're gonna work on getting our battery installed in the trunk and then running a wire into the engine bay. Alright, so here's the new location of the battery. We're also gonna remove the rear seats at some point, just to clean this up even further. But we're basically going to put it back here. I'm going to try to put it as close to the passenger side as possible just to kind of offset the driver a little bit. But I don't know how much room I'll actually have to do that. But the first thing I'm going to do is clean up this spare tub area and get it ready to mount a new battery box. Okay, much better. Based on how the spare tub well is shaped, I think this is pretty much the only way I could get it to sit flush, which is right directly in the center. But I'm okay with that. Before we mount this though, we are going to have to prepare the connections to the battery as well as the vent tube coming out. So we're going to pull this out and make some holes. So the way that this battery box is mounted is actually quite simple. All that's going to happen is we're going to basically drill 2 holes and put these studs down, and those studs are going to come up through the spare tire well into 2 holes inside the bottom of the box, and we're going to basically thread 2 nuts from the top and then 2 nuts from the bottom to hold these studs into place. Then we'll drop our battery in and then put this hole down on top of the battery where our studs are going through these 2 holes, and then bolt this down. So the first thing we'll do is just drill 2 holes in the bottom of the box, and I'm just going to do it centered horizontally so that it'll basically go through right about here and here. Now we'll use our battery box as a template and mark where our holes will be drilled. So now I'll get my studs ready. I'm just gonna thread on a nut right here, and then this is gonna go through the hole in the battery box through our spare tire well. And then from the bottom we'll have another locking nut with a washer that's going to secure it. Alright, so our battery box is mounted. Our studs are going through the holes on the spare tire well. So now we're just going to raise the car so we can access those studs from below and secure them. So as you can see, we have our two studs coming through. What we'll do is put one of these washers here, and then underneath that we'll secure a locking nut. So the length of this stud is actually going to be adjusted by the top nut inside of the battery box. So I could already tell that this locking nut will only go about that far. So it's a decent amount of stud that we'll have to basically go in the other direction before we could tighten it from down here. Now that we sorted out the length of our studs, you're going to have to hold this top nut while you thread in the locking nut from the bottom. Normally I would have a helper hold this in place, but I just jammed a wrench in there and hopefully it stays when I tighten from under here. Alright, so my battery doesn't have a provision for a vent tube, but I figured adding the tube that it came with to the box itself would have increased the ventilation, which I think is a good thing. So I added that in, and now we'll run a wire from our ground post to a ground, and I'm going to use the existing point where the spare tire was. I'm going to put a little spacer right here just so that I could have a flat surface to mount a terminal to. Alright, so now we'll strip off some of this insulation. Then we'll make sure everything's nice and tight. And slip our ring terminal on. So we'll place our wire with our terminal in this nice little press and crimp it on. As you can see, a nice little ring terminal for our ground connection. Alright, so now I'm going to attach my terminal over here and run this through. Alright, the next thing we're going to handle is the wire that's going from the positive terminal all the way to the engine bay. And one thing that we want to do first is add a fuse as close as we can to the battery. If something happens to our power wire somewhere alongside this route and it shorts out, we do not want that coming back to the battery and causing something extremely dangerous like a battery fire or anything like that. So what we're going to end up doing is putting a fuse in between, and I'm running a 250 amp fuse right there. So we're going to install that and then proceed. Alright, so this type of fuse box is pretty easy to install our wire. So what we'll have to do first is unscrew this cover and then strip our wire, insert, and then tighten down the Allen key that secures it. Alright, so as you can see, we have both of our wires ready. We'll just have to add our terminals on this side, and we have our ground all set, and we have our fuse installed. So now we just have to run the wire from this fuse box to the front of the car. That's gonna be fun. So we're basically going to run the wire behind this panel right here, underneath this panel over here, and all the way through the firewall. So to clear up this space over here, I'm just going to remove the seat, which should be pretty easy. And anyways, then we'll just take off the panels and run the wire. Alright, so we have our wire running from the back of the car all the way underneath the dash and through the firewall. Then it comes out just to the left of the brake master cylinder. As you can see, comes down right in front of the starter. So what we're going to do is connect that to the starter and then have another wire that comes off the starter into our fuse box that we'll build. Alright, so here's where we are now. We have our positive connection coming from our battery, going to our starter, and then another wire coming from our starter, and then this is going to feed our new circuit with our new fuse panel. So let's talk about how we're going to build that real quick. So this is how our circuit's going to work. We're going to have our 1/0 gauge wire coming from the starter and go into this T-fitting. So we'll have two more 1/0 wires, and each of those wires are going to feed into these two distribution blocks. So we'll have 1/0 wire going into each block, and that's going to allow us to run 4 circuits off that. So a total of 8 since we have 4 on both. And we'll basically add fuses to all of our circuits, and the connections will come on this side. So the first thing I'm going to do is just mount everything, secure it in place, and then we'll begin wiring it. Planning to use those same 4 holes that mounted the battery tray. Alright, so I think that should work. Now I'm going to hook up this ground connection before I tighten that down. I wish I had matching screws to clean this up, but unfortunately I don't. Now we'll mount our components. Alright, so we have everything mounted. So now we're just going to tackle each circuit one by one, starting with this T-fitting right here. So we're going to basically feed this wire right here, and then create 2 more wires that go right into these distribution blocks, and then we'll just go through each circuit on the outputs. Alright, first we'll do these 3 small circuits over here. These are each 30 amp fuses. Alright, our 3 lower powered circuits are done. We have 3 30 amp fuses right here. So next we're just going to continue with our alternator. This is going to be protected by a 110 amp fuse, so we're just going to add that to the last block right there. Alright, so our first block is good to go. Now we have 4 remaining circuits to add. We have another 110, and then a 40 amp, and then 2 50s. Alright guys, we are good to go underneath the hood. Look how pretty that looks. So we could piece out all of these old components. We just have one more thing left to do. That is to hook up the battery terminals to our cables. So everything is hooked up nice and tight. We have our wire going into the engine bay to our new fuse panel. And as you can see, we must have done something right as our interior lighting is now on. So let's just try this out and start it and make sure we're not going to blow anything up. Well, our work here is done. The car started without a problem. Now we just have to put on all of our panels as well as our battery box cover, and then all of our fuse boxes have plastic covers that we'll install. But I'm not going to bore you guys with that just because also we're about to get poured on. But all in all, not too bad, and I'm pretty happy with the fact that we now have this nice dedicated and reliable fuse panel, and also it looks so much cleaner in the engine bay now. Alright, well that's going to do it for today's episode. If you've been following along thus far, you have a battery inside of your trunk for better weight distribution, you have more space in your engine bay, and you have a more reliable fuse panel. So I have a few more projects lined up for the Mark IV. It's been a pretty fun build so far. Let me know what you guys think. I'll catch you in the next one. Peace out.